My name is Ken Weston. I work for Splunk. I'm a security market specialist. I've been with Splunk for about a year now. I've been involved in security or technology for the last 15, 16 years. I've done a lot with security research and as a security analyst. Had the opportunity to present at Black Hat, presented at DEF CON a couple years ago, talked about how I've actually used data to put people in jail, tracking criminals, various types of criminals. But today I'm going to be talking about a particular type of crime with ransomware. One thing I think is really important for us to realize with ransomware is to understand the motives and some of the tools and infrastructure that these organizations are using. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about that, talk about the economics of ransomware, and then from there we're going to talk about how we can go in and help with prevention as well as detection. So first, I just want to go ahead and we have our disclaimer here, so it's all good. So a quick agenda. We'll do a little bit of an overview of ransomware. Then I'm going to talk about prevention, because one thing I've really discovered is that ransomware is really finding a way to monetize poor security hygiene. A lot of times, these adversaries, they've actually been inside of organizations for a long period of time. They've actually gone in, they've stolen data, health records, things like that. They've been inside of these networks for a while. Problem is, they didn't really have a way to monetize that. Sometimes they could download personal information, but if they don't have a buyer, they're not going to, it's not going to be very lucrative for them. With ransomware, that's really changed the game, is that if they find a vulnerability inside of an environment, they can really quickly, with ransomware, find a way to actually monetize that. We're going to talk a little bit about prevention, because really that's the best defense when it comes to ransomware. We're going to talk about some basic security controls that you should have in your environment, and then we're going to talk about how you can actually ensure that those are being enforced with Splunk. We're going to talk about detection. With detection, I'm going to focus a little bit on the endpoint. There's also going to be more hands-on lab tomorrow with Brodsky, and I'll talk about that too. Something you want to go to tomorrow. They're going to go into some actual real lab environment. They're going to use server ransomware. And then we're going to also talk about threat intelligence. There are a number of threat intelligence sources that are available. Some of them are very, very good. And I'll talk about how you want to leverage that threat intelligence in a little bit different way than your traditional threat intelligence feeds. We're also going to talk about vulnerability management, because a lot of the ransomware, again, it's taking advantage of poor security hygiene. It's identifying not just with exploit kits, things like that, but also with identifying vulnerabilities inside of a network. We saw that with healthcare, for example. And then we'll talk about how the Splunk ecosystem fits into that. So is anybody here in your organization, incident responders, you guys had anyone here dealt with ransomware in your environment? Wow, quite a bit. Great. So, so there's a lot of different families of ransomware. So these are sort of what the different screens look like. And some of them are becoming much more sophisticated. A lot of them, what they would actually do is they would encrypt the files. And now they're even setting a timer. So not only do they encrypt the files, but then if you don't pay within a certain amount of time, it'll actually start to delete some of your files. And it'll actually wipe all that data. So it's really trying to get them to make sure that you pay that quickly. We've seen a lot of headlines around this. We've seen even law enforcement getting infected with ransomware. We've seen healthcare targeted. Some of those are very different. We saw ransomware start with consumers. So it started with targeting just your end users using exploit kits, getting them to download files, more focused on end users, not necessarily corporations. They then started to get pretty profitable, and they found if we actually target organizations instead of just relying on exploit kits, if I scan for a vulnerability in your environment and I can get inside of that network, then I'm going to be able to encrypt information, and it's more likely that a business is going to pay for a lot more money than your average end user. So we've seen this a lot. We've seen with healthcare, with the SamSam version of ransomware, and we've also seen a lot of other businesses get hit with this as well. And some of it's having a pretty significant impact, particularly when we look at healthcare. When you bring down healthcare systems, when doctors cannot access the patient records, that's not only is it bad PR, but it's also just bad for the patients. And we've seen that where people actually get turned away from an emergency room because the hospital has had ransomware. I did a lot of research. Actually, I've deployed some ransomware on an endpoint system. I was going to do a live demo here, but that may not be a good idea here on our network. But I do have a video just so you guys can see what it looks like. So on this one, what I'm actually doing is I deployed TeslaCrypt. Wow. Fires off here. So what I did was I just have it as a financials 2016 PDF document. If I execute that, sorry. So here are the documents that we have in a folder. They are not encrypted yet. It gets run. Now it gets encrypted. So it happens pretty rapidly. Usually all the files get encrypted within 5 to 6 minutes. So it just kind of gives you an idea of what you would actually see when you get hit with ransomware. It'll actually even show you the Bitcoin address that you need to pay. It'll also give you a list of all the files that they actually encrypted, which is nice and convenient. So, and also when so here's the list of all the files that were encrypted. Luckily, I didn't have any sensitive business stuff on this one. But so in this process too, I looked at what data was actually coming through. So I actually splunked the data. And I found that nothing really appears in the general Windows logs, general security logs. However, if you install Sysmon, so who out here is familiar with Sysmon? Good. So, great. So if you install Sysmon, we do have a TA that's available on Splunk base. You can actually get more information around that, what process got spun up. You'll also identify with TeslaCrypt, it actually does phone home. There's no command and control infrastructure for it, so if you, even if it doesn't have a network connection, it's still going to encrypt those files. But what's interesting is that when it does that, it actually sends out a beacon, and it tells you the Bitcoin address and some other information around that as well. So there are some indicators as long as you're running Sysmon, or if you're using a tool, endpoint solution like Carbon Black or Cylance, they're going to give you a lot more information around what happened when the ransomware gets triggered. One thing I found too was that there are a number of ransomware families. You can actually buy this on underground markets. It's fairly cheap. What's really interesting too is if you can actually see feedback from the folks that are using the ransomware. And a lot of these guys too, they're actually using this for almost ransomware as a service as well. They'll actually manage the entire infrastructure for you, and you can make a bunch of money. So if you want to work from home, start your own business, a ransomware business, come talk to me. I'll show you where the websites are. I'm just kidding. So just to give you an idea, I like to map ransomware you guys are all familiar with the Lockheed Martin kill chain. So you usually have a criminal syndicate. They'll create or buy the ransomware, or they'll lease it. And they have a lot of different ways they're going to infect it. So they're going to use watering holes, exploit kits, things like Neutrino. There's a few of them that are out there. They also might use a malicious email, so a link attachment. That was sort of the first way that a lot of ransomware was getting hit, was through phishing. And then also vulnerabilities inside of an environment too. We're seeing this happen where syndicates are actually actively targeting specific types of companies or industries looking for vulnerabilities. SamSam is a good example of that. When we actually saw a lot of healthcare organizations that were hit, it wasn't just one hospital, it was a lot of them. What they actually were doing is they were targeting vulnerability in JBoss. And so a lot of these hospitals, they didn't have it patched, and they knew this. They knew that the healthcare folks weren't patching their systems. So then from there, we actually have the information that the data gets encrypted, and then the person pays with Bitcoin, and that goes to the criminal syndicate, and that's how they make lots of money. So there's a real evolution that's happened with ransomware. It's becoming much, much more sophisticated. We're also seeing a lot of different families and a lot of ways of infecting the systems. And a lot of these ransomware families actually do operate in a lot of different ways. So it's almost impossible to rely solely on something like antivirus, because the hashes are constantly changing. Almost every infection has its own hash, so it's very difficult for antivirus to actually detect ransomware. And that's one of the reasons it has been so successful. So when it comes to delivery, the first method is it's going to be with email. So we see this quite a bit. Email attachments, so your traditional spear phishing attacks. Usually it's going to come in the form of a PDF document, or it can even be an executable in a zip file. You get someone to download that, and then they execute it, and then they're in trouble. And then you have exploit kits as well. There's a few of them that are out there: Angler, Neutrino, Fiesta, Magnitude. And that's been really popular. So people that are going to certain websites, they compromise ad networks and things like that, and that's how they're able to infect those systems. And also another one is vulnerabilities. So a lot of times plugins are being infected. So if you look at Adobe Flash, Microsoft Silverlight, Windows vulnerabilities as well, and then of course we mentioned JBoss with SamSam. And I'm starting to see a lot more of that too, where they're actually looking for other vulnerabilities in other applications. So if you have a good patch management process in place, it shouldn't be too bad. But make sure that your users actually have their plugins updated constantly. So how about on the defense side? What can we do? Well, I can tell you what doesn't work. There's no silver bullet. There's no single solution to actually help block ransomware. Sometimes some security vendors, they may say that they have the solution, but they don't. Also, what doesn't work is buying all the different tools possible, right? I've seen this with a number of customers. They'll go to RSA, they'll buy the best of breed of all the security solutions possible, but they deploy it, and it's not integrated. They're still relying on point solutions to defend their network. So it really requires a much more strategic approach. Splunk actually helps with this quite a bit because we are that security nerve center. I mentioned some of the different data sources on the endpoints, some of the different tools. We can bring all that data in. We can bring in Sysmon data. We can bring in data from things like Carbon Black. But we're also bringing data in from your firewalls, your apps, your network. We're also able to ingest that threat intelligence I was talking about, and I'll show you guys some examples of that as well. But you're able to get a lot more visibility into not only when you do get infected with ransomware, how did it happen, but also you're able to make sure that you have a good security posture. Is anyone here familiar with the CIS20? It's now the CIS20. Great. Okay. Who's read our white paper on it? Awesome. So there's a list of resources on my deck, so make sure you guys download the presentation. But one of the white papers I really recommend is the one we have on the CIS20. Again, we talked about these attackers are actually taking advantage of poor security hygiene. That's how they're getting into the network. So if we need a framework, I would recommend at least starting with CIS20. There's other ones that are out there, but this is where I would start. And download the white paper. It's a really good asset. And I want to talk about for the first 4, those 20 security controls are actually ranked. So number 1 is it's an inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices within your network, so your CMDB. As you notice, a lot of the ransomware, it targets Windows systems in particular, right? So that's what I'm going to focus the rest of the presentation on, is just on Windows in particular. There are families of ransomware that are being deployed for Linux as well as even industrial control systems and things like that. So I wouldn't put all my eggs in the Windows basket and think that Macs are safe. It's only a matter of time before ransomware hits those systems as well. We also want to have an inventory of authorized and unauthorized software. We'll talk a little bit about whitelisting, how that's actually one way to help defend against ransomware. And then also doing continuous security configuration for system hardening as well. That's really important. So when you have things like SamSam ransomware that's targeting vulnerabilities within an environment, that's one example. Another would be with continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation. So how many out there has a vulnerability management program? Right. So one thing you want to make sure you're doing is you don't want to just run scans every quarter. I've seen a lot of folks that are doing that. You want to have continuous vulnerability scans of your environment. And also you want to make sure you're operationalizing that data. If you have enterprise security, you have a great dashboard already that identifies all the vulnerabilities. Integrate that with your help desk system and your patching systems as well. Then you're going to have a lot more visibility into your defense. We look at data sources. We want to look at 3 different areas. We want to look at the endpoint, which we mentioned. We also want to look at network. So if we're looking at leveraging data like from Splunk Stream or Bro, that's going to give us some good data. And then we'll also incorporate threat intelligence as well. So one app I'd really recommend, particularly for identifying the authorized and unauthorized devices, is leveraging the Splunk app for Windows infrastructure. It's a great app, and it integrates with your Windows infrastructure you already have. Some of the dashboards are great, so you actually have visibility into what assets you have, what software are running on those systems, all those systems up to date as well. So how many here are actually using this app? Great. It's good to see. Yeah, so we can also, here's a good idea of, monitoring events, we're able to look for configuration as well as for patch verification to make sure that on Patch Tuesday all these systems do get patched. So a little bit too, I want to talk about group policy. So there are a number of ways to help secure your Windows infrastructure. So we want to make sure that we disable macros and Office files downloaded from the internet. I've talked to customers about this, and sometimes this is problematic because people in finance, they still need to be able to run macros and things like that. So you may want to work with those folks, have additional training to make sure that when you do have this enabled, that it does put you at risk. And there are other things that you can do on the GPO side. You want to try to disable the macros and Office files for users that don't need it. You also want to disable the Windows script host. You want to block all programs, executions from local app data and the app data folder. When I run TouchLeCrypt, it was all the stuff got installed into the app data directory. So if you block that, you're going to hopefully block some of the ransomware. You want to enforce administrative users to confirm an action that requires elevated rights. So again, about privileges. You want to force extensions primarily used for infections to open up in Notepad rather than Windows Script Host or Internet Explorer. Again, we're looking at vulnerabilities in browsers and Microsoft. So you want to force those to open up in something like Note, and you can do that through GPO. Then you also want to block program executions, and you can do that with AppLocker. We also want to, you can detect and block exploitation techniques with EMET, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, how you can leverage both of those. So when we look at sort of the onion of security, right, so we have our ransomware. If we have antivirus, that's going to help us identify known hashes of ransomware. That can be somewhat effective depending on the sophistication of the ransomware. The next layer of defense would leverage AppLocker. So AppLocker is going to help us identify known applications that we've whitelisted within our organization. Right, so if someone downloads the TouchLeCrypt file like I showed, and I try to execute that on the endpoint, if using AppLocker, it's not going to allow it to run because it's not a whitelisted application. Next would be looking at EMET. So a lot of times, some of the ransomware and malware in general it'll spawn new processes from whitelisted applications as well. So that's where EMET's going to help you defend it. It's going to be look at more at behavior on the endpoint. And then important thing too is known good configuration. So again, having the systems hardened and ensuring that's sort of a gold standard that's all throughout your organization, that's going to help ensure that folks aren't getting ransomware and download and install it on their systems. So just to give you an example here with Microsoft AppLocker, again, this helps cover critical control number 2 with application whitelisting. So AppLocker is built into the Windows OS and managed via group policy. AppLocker has no built-in remote logging capability. You'll find that no centralized logging capability, but you can be collected locally via Splunk Forwarder or using WMI. Who out there is using AppLocker in your environment? Okay, great. So I'm kind of curious, why don't folks use it? Is it too much of a hassle to get deployed? So management, okay, that's good. Yeah, I think especially with the newer versions too, with Windows 10, for example, it's actually a lot easier to get deployed and managed. But you do run into those issues where people want to be able to install certain applications. They want to be able to do things on their systems. So that's where you have to kind of balance this, right? The level of risk. So you may not be able to deploy this to all of the endpoints, all your laptops, and your entire environment, but you can enforce this on critical assets. So I would ensure, like, if I have an asset that needs to be part of PCI domain or critical business systems, that's where I would definitely want to make sure that I'm actually leveraging AppLocker. Because running in something like Flash or whatever on some of those systems, there's no reason that should be running on those particular systems. So you can leverage AppLocker for that. Just give you an idea of what your inputs.conf would look like when you actually enable AppLocker to get the data. Again, you guys can download the deck, you'll see this. But there's 4 different sort of groups that get clustered. But you bring that in, and you're able to start getting some of the data from AppLocker, which is really useful if you do have AppLocker deployed and you start to actually see ransomware in your environment, and you can actually show your management that, look, when we actually deployed AppLocker, here's the ransomware that we've actually blocked. You'll see that it is actually working. So some of the relevant AppLocker Event IDs, so when you actually see that come through, you want to look at 8000. That indicates policy was not applied correctly to a system. So you probably want to create reports from that if you're actually rolling that out to your environment. And then 8001 indicates that AppLocker policy was successfully applied to that system. So again, you want to have a dashboard around that. And this can help with risk scoring in your environment as well. If you know that these systems have AppLocker installed, successfully installed, using these event IDs, you can create reports around that. So 8002 and 8005 indicates app was allowed to run. The app name appears in the message of the log event. So you'll be able to see basically what applications were successfully run. The really interesting ones are 8004 and 8007. That indicates an app was blocked from running. So it would be an executable or a DLL. So that's really useful. So if you, for whatever reason, on a critical asset, it gets fired off, you'll be able to identify that. So some of the challenges is that it won't protect against whitelisted app exploits. So if, for example, you have a core business application or things like that, it's going to be a challenge. Also with Java, if you have Java enabled, it's basically all or nothing. So that's one challenge as well. With the admin privileges on a system too, bypassing AppLocker is going to be trivial. Right? So if someone is able to escalate privileges on that system, then of course it's not going to do any good. So let's say that we actually have some sophisticated malware that's, because he's wearing glasses, he's actually able to get through all this, right? He got through AppLocker, but all is not lost, because if they are able to get past it, let's say they're actually, the ransomware is actually targeting a vulnerability in a whitelisted application, they get into EMET, that's the next thing we're going to talk about, how it can block it. So EMET is offered at no cost by Microsoft and provides an additional layer of protection. So how many out here actually use EMET in your environments? Okay. So a lot more people are using EMET than AppLocker, it looks like. That's good. So it offers behavioral-based protections and anticipate, divert, terminate, and block common actions and techniques used by malware and adversaries. Like AppLocker, EMET is managed via group policy and verified with Splunk App for Windows infrastructure. But also like EMET, it lacks a centralized reporting capability and logging function, but it can be collected locally on those systems, again, similar to the AppLocker, using a forwarder or from a collection server. There was actually a really awesome white paper that was published by Carnegie Mellon. It actually talks about getting EMET logs into Splunk. It's great. We didn't even pay them for this, but it talks about how you can actually leverage Splunk as the log collector for EMET. So I'll make sure that you'll get this in the slide deck it's linked to. But if you're interested in actually bringing in EMET logs into Splunk, definitely would recommend this document. How many of you are bringing EMET logs into Splunk currently? Great. There's a few. Good. So there's a lot of people that were using EMET, right, but not necessarily bringing that data in, so I would highly recommend that you do that. Just to give you an example, this is what some of the dashboards might look like. Let's say I want to know, when Outlook, Explorer, Excel, when those are getting fired off. It's useful information. So let's say we actually have the malware that go all the way through all of our controls. Okay, we basically have a patient zero situation, because if we have AppLocker, we have all this data, these controls in place, that shouldn't happen. If we do, we're dealing with a very sophisticated adversary that's maybe dealing with some new type of ransomware that we haven't seen in our environment before, or maybe an issue of escalation. One thing that I've seen is a lot of times people have ransomware infections, but they have no logs, they have no data to actually go and identify how did that system get infected. Was it through an email? Was it through another source? If you actually have all these different controls in place and you have logging enabled, it's going to be a lot easier for your incident responders to go back and look at how that particular infection occurred. So another thing that you want to watch for is monitoring application crashes. So you can do that again through some of the event IDs, especially when you're looking at Flash or Silverlight. Usually when those types of those crashes happen, it means that there's some sort of a malware that it was actually hit that system, because that's the first thing that it's going to usually do is it crashes the application and then it spawns off additional processes from it. So it's something that you want to watch for. It's pretty easy to create some of these reports. But if you see an application that crashed tied with some other suspicious activity, that's something you're going to want to have your incident response team take a look at. So some of the event IDs for monitoring application crashes would be app error is 1000, app hang is 1002, and then the blue screen of death is 1001. So those are things you want to monitor in your environment. And not just for security. I mean, if you're not already monitoring that information, it's also useful for your IT ops teams as well. I would recommend checking out Michael Go's .conf presentation from 2015, Finding Advanced Attacks and Malware with Only 6 Windows Event IDs. He's also wrote the Malware Archaeology cheat sheet. You guys, who's familiar with that? I highly recommend taking a look at that. It'll be linked in the presentation as well, just to get a better understanding of some of the Windows event IDs and some of the data that's available. A lot of information is it's available to you, but a lot of people don't leverage some of that data. So definitely take a look at that. There is going to be more hands-on endpoint training in other sessions. With Brodsky, for example, they're going to be splunking the endpoint hands-on, and they're actually going to be going through it with the Cerber ransomware. They're going to be hands-on identifying what kind of data you can actually see as a result of that. Also hunting the known unknowns of the PowerShell edition. So if you want more information on endpoint and actually hands-on exercises, I definitely recommend taking a look at that. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about ransomware and threat intelligence. So a lot of times, I'm going to build this out. So usually when we look at threat intelligence, we're identifying usually the command and control infrastructure when we're talking about IPs and domains. Sometimes we'll have some data on file hashes and things like that. But with ransomware, it's a little bit different because there's different types of communications that will happen depending on the level or the point of infection. The first would be an exploit kit. So identifying where those exploit kits are, there's threat intelligence that are already around that. That can be helpful information. But that's going to be earlier on in the kill chain, right? So if we're able to detect and block that, we actually may be able to block the infection. The next would be the actual command and control infrastructure. Some of the ransomware will actually download the encryption keys from a remote system. So if you're able to block that, again, that's another point that you can actually ensure that you don't get infected. Then the last one would be the payment. So when a user in your environment goes to Tor, for example, or to a known payment website for Bitcoin, that means all has been lost. And actually, you can leverage that as threat intelligence as well. If you actually see that a user has gone to that website and maybe they even paid the ransom, that's information that you would want to know. A lot of times, organizations, they actually are hit by ransomware, but they're not aware of it. Someone in accounting downloaded it to their system, and they'll actually pay the ransom because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. But that puts the organization at risk because you don't have visibility into that because it could also be part of a larger attack. Maybe those phishing emails or links to watering holes were sent to a lot of other people in the organization. So if you're able to have some visibility and know that that system was infected with ransomware, then you can maybe go through and identify how that happened and then help block the larger attack. So one really good threat intelligence source is it's from abuse.ch. They have what's called a Ransomware Tracker. And I actually have some dashboards that I created from their threat intelligence. But with their feed, there's one you can get, and they actually list out if the threat intelligence, the server, what kind it is. So is this the exploit server? Is this the C2 server? Or if it's a payment website as well. So it's really helpful to have that information available to you. And you can bring that directly into within enterprise security very easily. You can even bring it into core Splunk as well. I can show you guys how to do that if you're interested. Come see me after, and I'll show you some of the dashboards I created. So, anyone here using this particular threat intelligence feed? Awesome. So a lot of people are. It's a really good website to go to, too. They have a lot of other information around prevention, a lot of the stuff we covered here, but they go into some depth, particularly around some of the specific families. So you can actually subscribe to, if you just wanted to see CryptoLocker or one of these feeds, they actually split that out for you as well. So next I want to talk about vulnerability management. So we talked a little bit about SamSam ransomware. It hit several organizations, starting with hospitals. They then shifted to schools. They basically had vulnerable, misconfigured JBoss application servers that were internet-facing. So identifying vulnerabilities in your environment, that's the first thing you want to do if you have running things like Nessus or Qualys or any of those vulnerability management tools. I would also recommend using Shodan. Anyone familiar with Shodan? Okay. There is an app that's actually available that you can bring into Splunk, and you can put in your subnets, and it'll actually show anything that appears in Shodan in your environment. So that's another thing that you can actually leverage, because a lot of hackers, these criminal syndicates, actually use Shodan as well, or they're using scanners that would show that same type of data. Yeah, and actually with this too is that a lot of the criminal syndicates, they are getting much more sophisticated with this. It was this year so far they've made over $200 million from ransomware. They're expecting it to be about $1 billion business by the end of the year. So those folks, you know, they've sensed the money. There's a lot more organizations, and so they're getting a lot more sophisticated in some of the tools that they actually have to exploit your environment. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more attacks like the SamSam one, where it's not just relying on people watering holes and things like that, but it's going to be much more targeted towards specific organizations to grab that to get into environments. Most important thing with ransomware too is just to ensure that you have information backed up. If you have a good backup policy and a system gets infected, you can get it back to that trusted state. There are a number of backup providers that are out there. A lot of them actually they actually have Splunk apps as well. So you can integrate that with your GPO as well to ensure that you're actually have that enforced. So, connecting the ransomware dots. So again, if we look at the kill chain, we want to talk about threat intelligence, leveraging external threat intelligence, internal threat intel, and indicators of compromise. For internal threat intelligence, I would even say help desk tickets. I would have that be available. For your incident responders as well, that information can be very valuable, especially if you've had a ransomware incident. It's really helpful. So you're able to then identify ransomware hashes, distribution sites, the C2 infrastructure, and then the payment sites as well. Then on the network security side, we want to identify with firewalls, IDS, we can see where ransomware was actually delivered. Where in our environment did it actually get executed, and were any file shares affected? That's one challenge a lot of times is that all of a sudden a network, a shared file server gets encrypted, and no one knows how it actually happened, what all these other devices are actually connected to it. But if you have those logs we talked about, it's easier for your incident responders to go back and identify specifically who actually downloaded that malware, what asset actually triggered that infection. Then we want to look at on the endpoint, so that's where we're actually leveraging our AV, IPS, and firewalls. If you want to get more sophisticated too, using tools like Carbon Black will give you more visibility at the endpoint. There's also doing some really interesting things with the adaptive response as well. So you're not only just looking at the data and what actually happens, but you're actually able to block it before it actually gets executed. How many folks are using a tool like Carbon Black or Cylance? Okay, quite a few. Okay, a few. Great. And then, of course, we have authorization and user roles, so leveraging Active Directory, LDAP, and CMDB. From that, we're able to make sure we identify access levels. We want to make sure that you keep an eye on the privileged users as well, and the likelihood of infection, and then how many other systems may have been infected. You may have those sort of patient zero issues where one person does get ransomware on their system, but you can leverage intelligence that you actually glean from that infection to make sure that other systems aren't compromised. So in summary, we want to make sure that we use the Splunk App for Windows infrastructure for policy verification and Windows asset inventory management. Enable AppLocker and EMET, at least on your critical assets. Set up AppLocker and EMET logging using Splunk. You want to leverage threat intelligence with ransomware, the ransomware kill chain in mind, right? So not all IPs and servers are equal. We want to leverage threat intelligence, we want to leverage Enterprise Security's Vulnerability Center and Threat Intelligence Framework. You also want to leverage the Splunk ecosystem and technology partners. So, great. And then if you guys can download the deck, I'll make sure that you guys have this, but there's a number of resources available. Again, I would highly recommend the CIS20 Whitepaper, the Operationalizing Threat Intelligence using Splunk Enterprise Security Whitepaper as well. There's the Creating Centralized Reporting from Microsoft Host Protection Technologies with Splunk. That's the one from the folks at Carnegie Mellon. I highly recommend that. It's a really great document. And of course, the Malware Archaeology Windows Splunk Logging Cheat Sheet. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much.